Hello, welcome to the conversation on News Central Television. This is a program where we bring you the latest political updates happening on the continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa.
And I'm Rita Omodia. On the program today, we will be discussing the latest update from Ethiopia, where the government has declared an indefinite humanitarian truce. Also, we'll take you to South Africa, where the leader of Operation Dudula, Nhlanhla Lux Dlamini, has been arrested.
Now let's begin in Ethiopia, where authorities in the region of Tigray have agreed to do everything possible to ensure the success of a ceasefire. This comes after Ethiopia's government earlier announced an indefinite humanitarian truce in the country's civil war. The government added that it hoped to help hasten the delivery of emergency aid into the Tigray region, where hundreds of thousands have faced starvation.
The Tigrayan forces also said they were committed to a pause in hostilities as long as the government took concrete steps to allow aid into the region. Since war broke out in northern Ethiopia in November 2020, thousands have died and millions remain displaced as the conflict has expanded from Tigray to the neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. Join us live on the conversation today are Simon Tesfaye, a Tigrayan national and founder of DW Foundation. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Also, we have Emnet Negash, PhD candidate, Net University, Belgium. He's also an assistant professor at Mekelle University, Ethiopia. He joins us from Ghent, Belgium. Gentlemen, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure having you. Now, let's start with this. What do you make of the surprise announcement of an indefinite humanitarian truce by the Ethiopian government? Do you see this as a welcome development?
Well, if true, it is a very good step forward. But what we've seen in the past from this government is they like to play games and they keep coming up with this crazy announcements every time. They've said this multiple times. This is not the first time they've said they would allow humanitarian access to Tigray. They've done it multiple times. It's just all about propaganda, trying to deceive and lie the international community. So until we see a handheld evidence showing that the Ethiopian government will allow humanitarian aids to go to Tigray, I'm not going to see it as a step forward. I'm just going to see it as a propaganda until I see something handheld.
Okay, Simon, I'll stay with you now concerning this Ethiopian government's troops. Now, earlier on, the authority in Ethiopia actually said that they were not stopping humanitarian aid into Tigray region, but actually it was rebels who were blocking the aid. What do you have to say to this?
So one thing to keep in mind with this announcement, what makes it funny is, yes, the federal government has multiple times said they would allow aids to go to Tigray, but what's going on is not just the federal government that controls those areas. There are multiple other stakeholders like the Eritrean troops, the Afar Regional Special Forces, and the Amhara troops. And in my opinion, they're just playing games. That's what they do. The federal government will do something, and the Afar Regional Force will say another thing. The Amhara militias will say another thing, and it's just games for them. So the first question that we need to ask is: does the federal government, the Ethiopian government, has full control over Ethiopia? And just an announcement coming from the Ethiopian government, does that mean that the Afar Regional Forces or the Eritrean forces will allow those aids to go in? In the past, we've seen that the federal government has zero controls in those areas. They've labeled a group of militias that are armed in Amhara region named the Fanos out of control, and they're the ones that run those regions. So for me, it's just games until all parties come together, discuss, and come up with a solution. And the funny part is they've called it a unilateral truce. How can you have a unilateral truce when your conflict is based on several regions? There's the Tigrayan forces as well, there's the Ethiopian forces, in addition to the Eritrean and the Amhara militias as well. So unless all of them come to table and discuss and come up with a solution, this is just games.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Moving to you, Emnet. What do you make of this announcement? It's not the first time that it happened. It happened last year. And a day after prisoners were released, the Ethiopian Air Force did bomb Mekelle, did bomb Tigray, and it led to lots of casualties. So what's your reaction to this latest declaration of a unilateral ceasefire by the government in Addis?
Thank you for that. And Simon has made important remarks on that. And in principle, this is a welcome development that people are perishing in a dark without having food and medicine, and without even being able to contact to the rest of the world. And in this time, it's a welcome development, but I'm afraid this is not any different from the developments that has happened last year in June, which they termed it to be a unilateral ceasefire by then, and now again it has come to be a humanitarian truce, and which really doesn't really make sense. And of course, if you see to conflicts all over the world, humanitarian access is not supposed to be conditioned with any military or political conditions. But in this case, again, if you have seen the statement made by the Ethiopian government, it asks the Tigrayan forces to withdraw from Afar and other areas, it says. But why is it supposed to be conditions? It is not supposed to be conditions. And I blame the international community, especially the US, which it has also, through the Samantha Power, which is head of the USA, which had in last year, in August, who conditioned that if the international community has to deliver humanitarian aid, that the Tigrayan forces has to withdraw, which means literally the U.S. government was also accepting this condition that humanitarian aid was conditioned with military with military and movement and political issues, which is completely wrong. And it was supposed to be free from any preconditions. And so it literally means the Abiy government and the Ethiopian government is playing a diplomatic games, and to say that he has stopped it because they have not withdrawn, or we have not done this and that. So it's unacceptable and useless for me. But if it's to be practicable, of course, this will be a welcome development. But I don't see it as a significant development. And then if this was a meaningful development, then you see that the governments in Afar, the Afar authorities and the neighboring Amhara and others are blocking it. The Ethiopian government sometimes allows, and the regional authorities blocking it. So it's a diplomatic game, and these are all in his control. He could have done it in a single telephone call. And not only that, but if he was willing for a peace deal and for positive developments, they could have allowed at least the telephone, the banking, electricity, and other services which they could do with a single click in their machines there in the federal authorities.
All right, over to you now, Simon. We've heard from the Ethiopian government, and both of you have agreed that it's more of a political move. And according to Negash, he said a diplomatic game. But the TPLF responded, and they agreed to a cessation of hostilities, a turning point in the nearly 17-month war in northern Ethiopia following the government's announcement of an indefinite humanitarian truce a day earlier. Does this set the tone for an end to the 17-month war, since we're seeing from the other side now? Simon?
Simon, you have to unmute your mic. Yes.
Sorry about that.
Right.
As I said earlier, the Tigrayan, the Ethiopian government has declared, and it labels it as a unilateral truce. But the Tigrayan government has come out and said they've agreed by default, making it a bilateral agreement. But the question is, which party has for the longest asked for peace? The Tigrayan government, they've been requesting for peace agreements and discussions and table round talks for the past 17 months. It's the Ethiopian government that has denied those and wanted to have this conflict going on for a while. Will it make a difference? In my opinion, it will not make any difference, because this is not the first time. You can take the June 28th incident where the Ethiopian government declared a unilateral ceasefire, and they were just bombing and fighting as they go. For me, as my friend has mentioned, it is a diplomatic game, and the reason behind it is let's see what is happening in the international community and in this discourse. If you see what's happening in the U.S. with the HR 6600 being brought to the Senate to be passed, once that is passed, that's it's a huge blow to the Ethiopian government. So they're trying to prevent from this kind of legislations being passed. They're trying to play games and see if they can kind of stall or delay those actions being taken against them.
Thank you, Simon. Staying with you, Simon, don't you think both sides have had enough of this unnecessary bloodletting, and they will come to a point where, because the war can't go on indefinitely, like you said, and a couple of analysts have said, you know, it's because of this resolution coming up, and they might sanction the government in Addis Ababa. So Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is playing games, because if you're going to declare a ceasefire, why don't you also withdraw your troops from Western Tigray and other things that the panelists mentioned earlier? So what will it take to bring both sides together to hold up their own end of the agreements? Because like Rita just said now, the TPLF has said, okay, we agree to a cessation of hostilities, forget things that have happened in the past and all of that. What would make you feel that, okay, we're not back to June of 2021?
So the first thing is, the Ethiopian government and Ethiopia in general have a constitution, right? The first step is to accept and implement those constitutional mandates. And under those constitutional mandates, Tigray is a sovereign region with its own borders. At this point, there are Eritrean troops, which are foreign troops, in Western Tigray, killing and massacring innocent civilians. The first step for the Ethiopian government to take is to withdraw those troops out of those regions. The first step should be that. The next step is, yeah, they've talked about humanitarian truce, okay? As my friend mentioned earlier, there are certain things that can be done in seconds, like restoring telecommunication, restoring electric power. These are simple actions that can be taken and implemented. And this can only be done by the federal government. So that when you ask arguments to happen, what has the federal government has done, and what is the Tigrayan government has to do? The Tigrayan government has withdrawn its troops out of those regions it was controlling in the past in the name of peace. But the Ethiopian forces, they just didn't remove their forces from the Western Tigray, but they're using drones and aircrafts to bombard civilians. There was a report that came out yesterday that showed the Ethiopian government bombarded 3 schools, in addition to 3 camps that were holding IDPs, internally displaced civilians. So it's just, there's 2 parties going on right now. In order for you to have argument, both have to come to the table and discuss. One is choosing violence and the other is choosing peace. The only solution to this is to sanction the one that is choosing violence and bringing them to the table, and be it by force or by international mediation or kind of sanctions. So this is why we always say, if peace is to happen, it has to happen by the force of the international community, by forcing the Ethiopian government into peace talks, by sanctions and other means, as simple as that.
All right, Emnet, over to you then. Now, Simon has mentioned the bombardment of about 3 schools, and while Gbenga was asking for solutions there, he talked about constitutional mandates, and of course the Ethiopian government needs to withdraw the troops. But let's look at some of the reasons why probably the Ethiopian government will not necessarily go on with the Unilateral Truce, and the TPLF also making it a political move. Could it be that both sides fear exposure of human rights abuses? Emnet, can you hear me? All right.
What we have witnessed from the beginning of the conflict is that the Tigrayan authorities has been ready for a peace deal and even a cessation of hostilities at all stages of the conflict. We remember the letters that were wrote from the Tigrayan authorities to the AU and to the then head of the AU, which was Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, and several other international authorities, showing that we are ready for it would be possible to avert this conflict with a peace deal and all. And even later, they have been ready for any peace talks, which was apparently clear. Besides that, we have also been witnessing the diplomatic games from the Ethiopian government. We start again from whether it's from June or so. Where are we now? If we see at where we are now, we have estimates of about 500,000 people who might have died from starvation and lack of medical care and direct killings. And we are saying we have about 150 to 300 people dying daily from lack of medical care, and about 425 to 1,200 people dying from famine. And with this, there's that growing international pressure, and also, which Simon has mentioned earlier on, which is the HR 66800 resolution, and several other pressures. And of course, the economy of the country is also slowly collapsing, because the country's economy has been largely invested on war. And for this, there's that growing pressure. And now that they are into saying this, but not into real promise, into real practices. And I am not expecting it, and that's why they are conditioning it with other reasons, so that they could easily say, we are not respecting into this, and so that they could easily continue doing this. And that's how I see it.
Okay, thank you, Emnet. Now, Simon, this conflict has been raging for 17 months. It's a high-intensity war. And I would just like you to tell us what some of the consequences of this war has been, especially on the people of Tigray. What are some of the humanitarian consequences of this protracted war that has been going on for quite too long now?
To be honest with you, this is a very hard question, because it has affected each and every Tigrayan personally, me, myself. I have my family back in Adigrat. I haven't had a chance to talk to them for the past 17 months. I don't know if they're still alive. I don't know if they're starving right now. I don't know if they're sick, if they're getting medication. No clue. So the impact of this war is not just affecting Tigrayans within the region, but Tigrayans all across the world. Since the war had started, every Tigrayan has felt the pain. It knocks on our doors on a daily basis. We're hearing news of close families being murdered, being killed, in addition to dying due to lack of medication. Imagine having a sister or a brother that is a diabetic, and you know there's lack of medication, and you know there's so limited medication, and you don't know if that brother or sister or your father is getting those medications or not. On a daily basis, thinking you're going to get a call telling you they've gone. This is the effect that it has on me and other Tigrayans that are the diasporas. But imagine what is happening in Tigray. Imagine those who are dying because of lack of food. Imagine starving to death. And think about those beautiful young women that were raped by this Eritrean forces and Amhara militias and the Ethiopian troops, and they're giving birth to children that they bared through rape, and those children are being born in a hospital where there's no medication. Imagine a deformed baby being born because of lack of nutrition of the mom.
So, Simon, these are very terrible pictures you just painted, and it's harrowing. We have the African Union, you have the United Nations, international development partners. Why is this conflict not getting enough attention, the attention it should? And why are they not putting, the Ethiopian central government and Addis Ababa, they're the bigger people in this picture. They're the ones that have the means. They could be the bigger party to end this conflict. Why is there no pressure?
That's a very good question, and I genuinely used to believe in diplomacy and international advocacy, and I always thought that the world will stand with humanity and bring up solution. But what we've learned, especially since the beginning of the Ukraine war, is it's not about humanity. Rather, it's about politics, geopolitics, and other interests as well. It's simply as we're Africans, as simple as that. If you see what happened in Ukraine. Within a couple of days, the world turned their face, and everybody was willing to accept and help, the Ukrainians, which is a good thing to do. But when you ask, what about Tigray? What happened in Tigray in Ethiopia? This war has been going on for the past 17 days. You cannot even kind of equate those two wars. The Tigrayan war is by far very devastating. Over, as I said, 500,000 people have lost their lives. Over half the population is in the brink of collapse. So when you compare it to what happened in Europe and Ukraine and the response that has gotten, it's just as simple as disappointing and enlightening for most Africans as well. So in my opinion, it's just as simple as that. We're Africans, and that's how it is.
All right, Emnet, over to you there. Earlier on, you blamed the international community for all this. Do you think the regional leaders now have done enough to end this war in Ethiopia?
Yes, I don't think they have done enough. This was supposed to be about an agenda, an issue about humanity. We have international and regional charters saying that humanitarian access should never and by any means conditioned. And no African, I would say, at least the AU or other responsible authorities or the international community has never said this is, I mean, they have said it, but they have not been into their words to go into practice. And this is still being conditioned, and it's not only about the humanitarian access, but also part of the human rights. And people are now denied not only food, not only medicine, but the banks they have had, the electricity, the telephone, and all. So it's not just a question like to have electricity, telephone, and banking as a gift, but it's a service for which they pay. It's if we are even if we are, for instance, asking for banking, it's not just money for gift, but it's the money they have had deposited in the banks, and which they would pay for the services. If we are saying about electricity, it's the service for which they pay. The telephone, the internet, and all, it's the service for which they pay. And if it is about this, the humanitarian access and all, this should never by any means be conditioned with politics and military stuff. And this has to be immediately released. But then if we are to talk about peace deal and all, and more positive development, again, this needs more and more engagement, and the international community should by any means accept and support and embolden such tyrants who are conditioning humanitarian access and humanitarian law.
Thank you, Emnet. Like you rightly said, peace can't come without justice. And just a few months ago, Simon, the former head of the International Criminal Court, the chief prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, was appointed by a UN commission she was appointed to lead a UN commission of inquiry to investigate war crimes committed by both sides in the conflict. Are you confident or hopeful that perhaps later, when all of this conflict is over, justice will be served? Because you painted a really, really terrible picture of things that are happening in Tigray.
Yeah, I believe justice will be served. But when you talk about the United Nations appointing a head to lead the investigations, one thing to keep in mind is there are two parties again that are involved in this conflict, and both of them have been accused of
abuses,
abuses and massacres and a whole lot of accusations. So one has said they're open to investigations. They're willing to be investigated at any point, at any time. They're welcoming these investigations. And the other has said this is an intervention to our sovereignty, and we don't accept any kind of investigations and the likes. So that by default would make one of the accused kind of a little bit shady, if that makes sense. So will justice be served? Definitely. It might take time, it might be a year or two. Me as a Tigrayan, I'm not going to sleep until justice has been served. Those who have committed the atrocities will be brought to justice. And that is not going to happen just because the United Nations have appointed a commission to investigate. It's because me as a Tigrayan, every single Tigrayan, we're going to dig deep to bring these criminals to court, be it going to court or pressuring the international community. We're just going to make sure they're going to be brought to justice. There's no way to hide for them. If by any means they've committed any crime, any atrocities, the Tigrayan community will bring them to justice, be it to the International Criminal Court, be it to the federal courts of Ethiopia, be it to the courts in Tigray, be it to the US courts. It does not matter. Somehow, some way, me as a Tigrayan and my friends, my brothers and my sisters, the Tigrayan community will bring these criminals to justice.
All right, now, Simon, I'll stay with you now. Last year, prisoners, including members of the rebel Tigray People's Liberation Front, in a bid to promote national dialogue, were freed. Now, one of those freed was Amhara politician Eskinder Nega, one of the several leading government opponents, rounded up after deadly protests erupted in 2020. What's your thoughts on the prisoners that were freed by the Ethiopian government?
Definitely. So Iskandar Nega, as you say, he's an Amhara nationalist. He's one of the people or political figures that have been advocating and pushing towards the current massacre and war that has been happening. Even though he was arrested, he's one of the prominent elites that have been advocating for Tigray to be invaded and for this current massacre to happen. But in my opinion, it's a good thing that he was released. I don't believe in, I don't think there's any single Tigrayan that believes in arresting political figures. Political imprisonment is unjust and it shouldn't happen. And it's a good thing that they were released. But again, the question that we need to ask is, why were they released? It was not just Iskandar Nega. Jawar Mohammed was released. Mekelle Garaba, who both are big political figures in the Oromia community, were released. In addition to that, Abui Sabat Nega were released as well, which was a retired TPLF member, as you say. But the question is, why? Why were they released? Why not release everyone?
I mean, the government then, the government in Addis Ababa said it was an olive branch to, show that they're committed to ending this conflict, just doing their part. And as the TPLF reciprocated these overtures by the government.
But the question is, so here's what we need to see though. Yes, they've said that, but what actions have they taken after that? After releasing them, were there peace discussion? Did they stop bombing Tigray? Did they allow food aid trucks to go to Tigray? No, they did not. Again, it was a political game. For them, this is all games. They released them because at that point, there was the AGOA controversy going on where the United Government was going to remove the Ethiopian government from the AGOA agreement, which allowed Ethiopia to benefit out of the exports from Ethiopia to the US. That's the game that they play. Again, the same thing is happening right now. They're saying they've called on a truce, a humanitarian truce. But are they going to implement it, or is it a political game? We've seen it again and again and again, and they keep playing games. And what we call on, when we ask for the international community is take actions. And if the Ethiopian government is willing to uphold those humanitarian truce, remove the actions, sanctions, be it whatever, remove it. Act. Once there's a solution, then we go forward. We just can't keep playing games where, I'll give you this, I'll take that kind of game. It doesn't work that way.
Now, Emnet, when this conflict started, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed thought it was going to be a short military operation, and it has dragged on for 17 months. There are reports of over 10 million people on the brink of starvation, and the picture is not pretty at all. What will it take to bring this protracted crisis to an end? It's 17 months now with so many dire consequences, especially for the people of Tigray.
Yes, as you said, it was said to be something to be wiped out or to be closed and in weeks' time, but now it is now about 18 months, and we don't see a clear end. And we have, like I said it earlier, we have about 500,000 casualties, not the military casualties, but the casualties of famine, the direct killings, those who died from the lack of medical care and all. And this is continuing, and more are now at the brink to this. And this is really crazy. This statistics is only about Tigray. We don't know about the rest of Ethiopia. And if we are to see this, to see an end to this, and the first thing that has to happen, that is never conditioned, as I said earlier, is humanitarian aid, humanitarian access should not be conditioned by any means, and the international community has to stand on this, has to firmly stand on this, and should not by any means support such a conditioning. And if we have to see an end to this further, and then we expect a positive development towards a peace deal and all, and for that we expect the public infrastructure, including the telephone, the electricity, the banking and all, should be released, the transportation and all should be released, and foreign hostile forces like the Eritrean forces and Amhara militia and all has to leave Tigray, and anywhere, any part of Tigray, whether Western Tigray, Northwestern, Northern and Eastern, and all parts of Tigray. And from there, the political prisoners need to be released. And from there, we would also expect the aspirations of the people. If Ethiopians want to be ruled by Abiy Ahmed or any political party they would want, they should be allowed to. And if Tigrayans would want to cease out, to leave Ethiopia, if they no longer want to live in Ethiopia, they should be allowed. And the aspirations of the people should should also be allowed. But most importantly, humanitarian access should not by any means be conditioned, and the international community should firmly stand by the charters, the international humanitarian law that we have.
Okay, Emnet, you've listed so many things that would bring about peace in Ethiopia, and so many things that you would want the government to do. So, Simon, over to you now. We're still looking at the ways forward, and some people have criticized the 1995 Ethiopian constitution. Do you feel it's part of the way forward there should be a constitutional referendum in Ethiopia?
Definitely. So, in my opinion, I don't think the current crisis has nothing to do with the constitution, but I feel like in general, for Ethiopia to go forward, the constitution amendment or referendum has to be had because there's a lot of disagreement when it comes to the constitution. But keep in mind, accepting the constitution and implementing the constitution would evade or kind of avoid the current conflict that's happening. The constitution, word by word, states Tigray is a sovereign nation. And invading it is by definition, kind of going against the constitution. So yes, the constitution has to be amended. In my opinion, should there be a referendum? Yes, Tigray should have a referendum. Ethiopia in general should have a referendum and come to peace and reconciliation. But the other question that we need to ask is, will Tigray be a part of Ethiopia after all this massacre, all these atrocities that have happened? And the sentiment in the Tigrayan community is no. I don't think you will find any Tigrayan that wants to be part of Ethiopia. And again, that's the bare minimum, right? If a given nation has said, we don't want to be a part of this, we want to be independent.
Would you accept a confederation? Yes.
So again, that's not up to me or a couple of Tigrayan elites or Tigrayan politicians. It's up to the vote. That's why we say we need to have a referendum in Tigray and let the people themselves speak. Who knows? They might choose to be part of Ethiopia as well. Who knows? But again, the sentiment that I have had with my friends, family, and community is they don't want to be part of Ethiopia. The atrocities that have been committed are just too much for us to accept and be part of this nation. And again, let them be vote. Let them vote. It's a simple thing. If a nation is saying, hey, we want to have a say, we want to vote, we want to see what the people want, that should be given to the people. That's basic democracy. So that's my take on it. But when it comes to Ethiopia, go ahead. Thank you.
I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Simon and Emnet, Simon Tesfaye, Tigrayan national and founder of DW Foundation, for joining us on this program, and Emnet Negash, a PhD candidate at Ghent University, Belgium. We do appreciate your insights, and we hope for peace to return to Ethiopia soon. Thanks for being a part of the conversation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our thoughts and prayers are with the families back in Tigray.
You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We just finished talking about the latest development in Ethiopia, where the government has declared a unilateral truce in northern Ethiopian region of Tigray. And we'll go on a quick break. When we come back in the second half, we'll be discussing the Operation Dudula leader's arrest. Do stay with us. The conversation will be right back. If you've just joined us, we've been discussing the conflict in Ethiopia. Now it's time for us to switch gears to developments in South Africa.
Now, in South Africa, leader of the anti-immigrant protest, popularly known as Operation Dudula, Nhlanhla Lux Dlamini, has been arrested and will spend the weekend behind bars after his case was postponed to Monday. Lux faces charges of housebreaking, theft, and malicious damage to property.
Now, his arrest drew criticism from members of his movement who use social networks and social media to threaten to intensify their activities. Since January, demonstrations called to fight for the future of South Africans and against migrant workers that have held regular demonstrations in several cities. Now, joining us to discuss this is Nhlanhla Baloyi. He is a sponsor of the Operation Dudula movement from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you very much for joining us, and a warm welcome to you, Nola.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening, Nota.
Now, Dlamini faces charges of housebreaking, theft, malicious damage to property. What's your reaction to all those charges leveled against him?
Well, we have reason to believe, there's political motives behind having him behind bars. We believe that they're trying to keep him behind bars as long as possible to incite his supporters into some form of, violence or revenge. And he has urged his supporters, to maintain high morale and high discipline. And after, protesting his arrest outside the police station in central Johannesburg this afternoon, his supporters dispersed this evening and will probably return every day until he's released or to be released on Monday.
All right, NATO, let's look at this Operation Dudula, which, of course, the leader, Dlamini, has been arrested. And, of course, according to reports, you're also a supporter of this particular movement. Now, we know that Operation Dudula has been going around to houses, raiding people who they term as undocumented immigrants. Now, on what or whose legal authority is Operation Dudula operating on?
No, that is completely false.
All right.
They have not gone to anyone's home who was supposed to be not a citizen of South Africa. In fact, the home which they entered, and they entered with police supervision at that time, was of a South African citizen who is also a former secretary of the Economic Freedom Fighters.
Yeah,
so why did they go to the home of Victor Ramarafe, according to you? Because that's where these charges are coming from.
The community, yes, the community had called them to intervene because they'd been reporting it to the police, saying that their children have been going in there buying nyaupe from this gentleman, and they've tried to call the police, and the police arrive at his home every single morning to pick up a bribe, and then they disappear.
Okay, Nota. Some human rights organizations have accused Operation Dudula of anti-foreigner sentiments and xenophobia. In Human Rights Watch's country report for 2021, it says South Africa continued to be plagued by widespread incidents of xenophobia, harassment, and attacks against foreigners. Is Operation Dudula xenophobic? Do you think Human Rights Watch is exaggerating the xenophobia problem in South Africa?
I don't think there's a xenophobia problem in South Africa. There's an inequality problem in South Africa. 10% of the country own 90% of the country's wealth.
Agreed, but we've seen, sorry to butt in there. I don't think it's quite correct
so the
to say
issue,
there's no xenophobic
in
problem.
South Africa, there is no xenophobia problem in South Africa.
What led to the protest last year, the burning, the looting of shops, and what have you?
So the looting of shops was not xenophobic violence last year. It was a protest about the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma.
Go on, Nota, because you were talking about there being no xenophobic.
So so we don't have a xenophobia problem. What we have is an inequality problem. And what happens is that because of the governments in the neighboring countries around us being so unstable, we have an influx of migrants into our country who are obviously desperate. And therefore, what they are doing is that they are now competing for some of the opportunities that are only available to our majority, which is low-skilled workers. And therefore, there's a clash there. And those are the most disenfranchised South Africans. Those are the South Africans who have been left out of opportunities for very long. And I think it is very unfair to put them in a situation where they have been deprived of opportunities, and now they have to compete for opportunities in a labor market that is distorted because people from neighboring countries are willing to work for next to nothing.
Now, you talk about inequality in South Africa. I know that on Monday, March 21st, South Africa celebrated Human Rights Day, and the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, once again reiterated this proposed migration labor law, which says that South African companies should not employ undocumented foreign nationals. Now, do you feel this will solve the issue of inequality in South Africa or build anti-foreigner sentiment? Because we get reports of people complaining of attacks.
I think you also misquoted the president. What he said specifically in mining, where there are over 30,000 foreign workers, and the government is aiming to reduce that to 5,000.
Would you fellow members do
you understand?
So if the government extends it beyond the mining sector, would you be happy?
Undocumented mining workers, that over 30,000 undocumented mining workers, and the government's target is to reduce it to 5.
Now, if you're looking at the mining sector, because you're saying it's not just general, it's just the mining sector. Now, do you feel that will actually solve inequality problems in South Africa?
None of this will ever solve the inequality problems in South Africa. I don't think the exodus of migrant workers will solve the inequality problems in South Africa. But what it will do is that it will stop the slave labor that happens in South Africa. South Africa is a slave labor-built economy, and our economy has been built on migrant labor, which was seasonal labor in the past. Because people who are either African or South African or Black were not allowed to be in the urban centers or where the mines are. They had to live in their Bantustans or in the reserves in places like Soweto, where Nhlanhla Lux comes from. And these are places that have been denied opportunities. These are practically labor camps. So the people that live in these places were basically placed there so they can provide labor. And they're sitting in their homes, not providing labor. And the reason they're not providing labor is because migrant labor is cheaper. And this migrant labor is so cheap, in fact, that it does not even demand a living wage. And therefore, it can only be classified as slave labor.
Okay, noted. A recent report just came out and described South Africa as one of the most unequal societies in the world. And it's been several decades since the end of apartheid. What is the government's response to addressing this inequality that sometimes breeds the seeds of xenophobia amongst the population? Has the government done enough to address this inequality, and what should they be doing?
No, the government is not doing anything. The government is consumed by infighting. The government is, a ruling party that is fractured, that is torn apart at the seams, and our ministers all have, a vendetta against each other. All of them are trying to get at each other. And because of these squabbles, this country is not being run. And therefore, our president is paralyzed by managing the egos of his cabinet, who are backstabbing each other, in a fight to the death for power. So the country is not being run. And that's why you're finding people like Nhlanhla Lux rising up, because there is a vacuum of leadership. Let me put it to you this way. We do not even have policemen that are pointsmen at our traffic lights in Sandton, the richest square mile in Africa. In fact, the hobos, the vagrants, the homeless people are the ones that direct our traffic. So a Maserati will be stopped by a homeless person and have to obey.
But note, don't you think people like Nhlanhla Lux are looking at the easy targets, these migrant workers that are earning nothing, that, like you described, they're earning slave wages? Why don't they go after the big corporations that also enabled this inequality in society? Why? I mean, and you rightly said it, that if there are no migrant workers in South Africa, it will not end the inequality.
They have no means to go after the big corporations.
So they go after migrant workers instead?
No, they don't go after migrant workers. They protest, and then they make sure that their protests are heard so that the government can pay attention to their grievances, because their grievances are not being heard. And their grievances are that these people who are coming in undocumented are not only just committing crimes. We had our Home Affairs Minister arresting someone just last night who had, been making fake passports for undocumented migrants and refugees, who are not supposed to be going in and out of South Africa and back to their home countries. And that's a United Nations convention that was signed in 1951 that is being disobeyed. That is not even just South African law. So, we've got a real lawlessness crisis amongst our undocumented immigrant population. And, just imagine that I'm saying undocumented immigrant population. That is, something that should have been managed and hasn't been managed. And that's the failure of our government. And our government has left this situation in the hands of the people to deal with. And the people do not have any other means to express their frustration than to protest. And this is exactly what they're doing. They're protesting, and the police are observing. And in the observance of the police, all these protests have been peaceful.
Nota, do you believe there's still racism in South Africa?
Of course, there's still racism. It's systemic. And that's what oppresses everybody, and therefore the oligarchs that run South Africa are keeping us oppressed by employing slave labor, knowing that it's going to cause, political ructions, because they also want to use this situation to destabilize our democracy.
Now, Nota, finally, before we let you go, quickly, if you could do this in less than a minute. We've seen the damning Justice Raymond Zondo reports that came out, the first part, second part, third part. We've seen the reports, the recommendations, the state capture, the amount of graft and theft that happened within the government of the Republic of South Africa that led to collapse and of state-owned enterprises. In that report, there was no single mention of migrant workers being responsible for all of this, for the inequality in South Africa's society or the economic backlash. So why don't the members of Operation Dudula focus on those culprits?
The Guptas had their citizenship falsified. So they were basically undocumented migrants, and they orchestrated the entire state capture operation. They used foreign bank accounts, to launder billions and billions of dollars out of our economy. And there is nothing we can do, because they were also doing
we'll probably
this
have
in partnership
part two
with our government
of this conversation. There's still so much to unravel, but I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Nota, for being a part of the conversation. This is how much we can take.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it on today's conversation. Do join us at the same time on Monday for another edition of the conversation. I'm Gbenga Aborowa.
And I'm Rita Omodia. Till next week, Monday.